Hi, everybody. Eve Harrow on Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network. It is June 13th, 2019, and I am sitting in the Ritz Hotel not far from Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. It's been a very busy couple of weeks. I'll catch you all up on that at another time because I grabbed the opportunity to interview again, even though it was a few years ago, so I'm sure most of you don't remember, Leen Ritmeyer, who I have his guidebook to the Temple Mount, and I hope all of you do. We'll talk about that in a minute. And for me, really, and for not just me, but for so many of us who are interested in Jerusalem, really, for a lot of us, the authority on the Temple Mount, and not just the Temple Mount of today, but the whole history of the mountain. So first, Leen, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you again.
Yes. So the first interview we just did, I think, by Skype. So this is actually the first time that we got to sit together. So I'm really excited.
But your voice still sounds the same, so that is good.
Okay, so the first thing that I want to note, which I just said to him, is he's wearing white pants, which proves that he's not an archaeologist, because archaeologists tend to dress a little scruffy, at least during the day. But you are here in Israel this week because of an archaeological dig?
Yes, I'm here because of the Shiloh excavations, and I wear pants because I just had a shower after I came back from the field. I also get dirty, although I don't dig and actually never have dug. A lot of people think I'm an archaeologist, but I'm not. I'm an architect who works in archaeology. So since 1973, I started to work on Temple Mount excavations, making survey plans and then architectural plans. I prepare publication plans, and therefore I'm in Israel now this week because they've been excavating for 4 weeks. I also come at the end to see which walls they have excavated, and then I try to interpret the stratigraphy, which wall belongs to which period, and try to understand the architecture in the different periods. And we had an exciting time in Shiloh.
So you obviously, though, know a tremendous amount of archaeology, even though you are officially an architect.
Yes, well, the work I do is kind of a combination of architecture, ancient architecture, and archaeology, and history and geography. So it's kind of a multidisciplinary work I am doing. It's not enough to see walls and make plans of them. I need to liaise with the archaeologist to know what kind of material comes out. For example, if you have two walls and there's a floor in between, then the stuff you find on the floor dates that particular building. So I can't always tell from the way the walls are built what period they belong to, although it's not too difficult. Say here in Shiloh we got a city wall which is 5 meters 25 thick. Now that is an enormously thick wall, and of course it's built with massive stones, sits on the bedrock, and it's not a great difficulty for anybody to understand that is a city wall. But the interesting thing is that on the inside of the city wall, in the Middle Bronze Age, we found a whole series of storerooms, which were actually underground cellar rooms, and they found massive pithoi, those big storage jars up to 1.50 meters high, where they stored, I suppose, wine and oil and dates and figs and whatever foodstuff they harvested. But of course, if you harvest something, then it has to last you for a whole year. So this was their fridge because it's underground, it's nice and cool, and that's where they stored all their food. So it was exciting to find that.
Wow, that sounds great. And I'm going to be catching up with Dr. Scott Stripling at some point also to get the lowdown on the dig this year's version of the dig. But what is your background? Like for my listeners who are thinking, okay, that accent, how can we place it? So tell us a little bit about how you got into this.
Okay, Ani nolade in Holland. That means to say I was born in Holland and I studied there. I got a degree in education, and in 1967 when I graduated, I came to volunteer in Israel just after the 6-day war. And I spent almost 6 months in Kibbutz Yad Mordechai next to the Gaza Strip. And I worked in greenhouses growing roses to send back to Holland, to Switzerland, of all places. But being in the land for the first time, I began to read the Bible, the Tanakh and the Brit Hadashah, and I could relate the Bible to ancient sites and the geography of the land, and that excited me very much. And I learned Hebrew, so I can read the Tanakh in Hebrew as well, and that gives you a greater insight into the history of the people of Israel and the meaning of the names of the land. I never knew that Hebron means the friend, and who is the friend was Abraham. He was the friend of God. So those are extra things you learn being in the land, which you can't learn outside in Holland. So that's why I started to get an interest in the land. I went back to teach a year and a half or so in Holland, and then I came to settle for good in 1969.
In Israel?
In Israel. Yeah, and I lived in Jerusalem for 20 years, but most of the time until 1989. And I started my archaeological career at the Temple Mount Excavations with Professor Benjamin Mazar. I started off as a surveyor, making plans, field plans. You work with a grid of 5 meters, and then you make plans scale 1 to 50 of every wall you find. And then I had to give them to the architect, who then separated different walls that belonged to different buildings, and he completed walls that were missing. And suddenly I saw, oh, actually I'm surveying a building, and I found it very interesting. So he gave me the Byzantine bathhouse to reconstruct, making sections through the building and see how the water supply worked, the big tub of water where they heated the water and so on. And I found it very interesting.
But just to clarify, this isn't actually on the Temple Mount that you're working with Benjamin Mazar, right? Because the Temple Mount itself has never been properly excavated. Are you talking about, let's say, the southern excavations or the area around, or you're talking about actually on the mount itself?
Now I'm talking about the Temple Mount excavations, which were conducted outside to the south and to the west of the Temple Mount. Later, of course, I developed an interest in the Temple Mount itself, but that's where I started. I worked for 4 years in the Temple Mount excavations, recording all the Herodian streets and the Byzantine bathhouses and the Muslim palaces. But my main interest was the Temple Mount itself, where you got the double and the triple gate in the southern wall and the Robinson's Arch in the western wall in our excavations. And so I tried to understand them, and later developed an interest in the Temple Mount itself, but not immediately, because I started to work as an archaeological architect and making reconstruction drawings. I met during the Yom Kippur War, when the army captured a big part to the north of Israel, the Bashan area, all the way up to Damascus almost. They found Roman buildings standing up 2 stories high, and there are young archaeologists of those days, like Ami Mazar and Dan Oerman and Tzvi Ilan and Amos Kloon. I got to know them in one go, as it were, and so they asked me to help them with their excavations as well later on. So I got to know a lot of archaeologists, but then I went to after I married an archaeologist from Ireland, my beloved wife Kathleen, and started to work with Professor Nachman Avigaat in the Jewish Quarter. First of all, again, recording excavation results, but then I got interested was asked to restore ancient sites. So, the Byzantine Cardo, the street with the columns. Well, I designed the reconstruction, I supervised the reconstruction as well. And then later a big project was the Herodian villas next to Ghurva Square, the underground Herodian villas. And for 2 years I worked underground underneath the Yeshivat Hotel to restore those buildings, to open up to the public. So I got interested in the restoration as well.
So just to back up a second, your childhood in Holland, because you said after the 67 Six-Day War, you came to Israel to volunteer. Not everybody did that. So what was it about your upbringing? I'm thinking you're being raised in Holland in the 2 decades just past the Second World War, the Holocaust. Did you know Jewish people in Amsterdam? I don't know where in Holland you're from. Did you know Jewish people? Were you interested in Israel itself or Judaism? Or what happens in 67 that lights this fire and you come here and then make the next 2 decades of your life here?
Yeah, well, I was born at the end of the Second World War. I never heard of Jewish people, never met them. I'm not Jewish myself. But my mother always read the Bible to us, both the Old and the New Testament. So then you already get an interest in the land of the Bible. And we learn about God, and as a Christian about Jesus Christ, which we believe is the Messiah. And so I was brought up with the Bible stories. And then when I graduated and the Six-Day War broke out, I was half a year free. I couldn't start teaching because in Holland there's military service, and I didn't get my call up, which came for March the following year. And I was reading the newspaper. I followed, with great interest, the 6-day war result. And we thought, well, how can Israel possibly win against all those overwhelming force of the Arab nations? But they did. And so the men that served in the army kept being mobilized for another half year or so. So there was actually big advertisement in the newspapers in Rotterdam, where I lived, asking for volunteers because all the men were mobilized and there was not enough manpower. So I thought, well, I got half a year free, so why not go? And so I went and landed up in Yad Mordechai.
Wow. Which right now is known as the kibbutz, where a lot of our jams and honey come from in Israel. It's a very famous label, but they also are not having such an easy time. They're just to the north of the Gaza Strip, so they're suffering from that as well. So you and your wife Kathleen, you really made a life for yourselves here, a career. I know that you had quite a few children as well.
Yeah, we have 4 children because we married in Jerusalem, and 4 of our 5 children were born in Jerusalem. We left in '89, but our youngest was born in England then. We got a daughter in Australia, so we got 4 nationalities in our family. I'm Dutch, my wife is Irish. Some of our children are Irish, some are Dutch, and my daughter is Australian. She lives in Australia, married an Australian. And my youngest was born in England, and therefore he's got an English passport. He's an Englishman.
And right now, where are you living?
We live in Wales, just outside Cardiff. Cardiff is the capital of Wales. Interesting name, by the way. Cardiff in Welsh, they got their own language, is Caer David. That means the castle of David.
Really?
Yeah, so I went from Israel to the castle of David. That's quite interesting. But we live just outside Cardiff. Got a lovely bungalow by the sea, and so we were working away there, just at home. Kathleen's got her work room, I got my work room. We work together, and on all sorts of interesting projects. And I still do 2 digs in the year. One is Shiloh, where I'm now, and in February time I go to Jordan, where we excavate Tal El Hammam, which we believe is biblical Sodom.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Even though it's to the north of the Dead Sea, correct, Al Hammam? Or am I wrong?
Yeah, of course. And that's what we read in the Bible, in Genesis 13, that when Abram and Lot were in Bethel and Ai, they decided to split up because there was not enough available grazing land for their flocks. And then Lot looked east to the eastern Kikar, which was well watered. Well, if you stand in Bethel Ai, we excavated for a number of years outside near Bethel, Gibeat El Makate, and you can see the whole of the eastern end of the Jordan Valley, north of the Dead Sea. So that side is exactly opposite Jericho. So you get Jericho, you get the River Jordan, and the same distance, same latitude on the other side. There's Tal El Hammam, which in the early Bronze Age was the largest city in the whole of the Levant, in the Middle East here. And it's the most interesting site. It was destroyed by cosmic fire. Yes, so it was an exploding meteor or something like that. And we saw fiery destruction there with burned bones, and it seems to reflect the destruction of Sodom as we read in Genesis chapter 19. By the way, Genesis 19 begins with Lot sat in the gate, and I was able to locate and identify that gate. So that's kind of interesting.
Wow. Now, I've been fascinated by that site because most people put Sodom in the south part of the Dead Sea and maybe even underwater now. And then I read about the site years ago where everything had turned to glass suddenly. Obviously something very sudden and very hot had hit it. When you read the biblical text, though, it almost sounds like some kind of volcanic eruption, and we know we're on a rift. However, the Bible says it came from the sky. So it couldn't have been from inside the Dead Sea like that. The Bible says from the sky. And then a few years ago in Russia, didn't some meteorite explode over the ground and do this? And then they went back to Hammam and said, maybe that's what happened here.
Absolutely, because in Russia, an area of 1,000 square kilometers was affected. Windows were blown out, and it was a terrible destruction. And something similar happened in our side, we think. One of our colleagues have been studying the result of that destruction. We found potsherds that have been turned to glass. You need a temperature of 6,000 degrees centigrade to do that. And as you say, it came down from heaven. There were no volcanoes there. It was not on the southern end of the Dead Sea, because people couldn't identify the site of Sodom, because it actually looked like a mountainside, and it was Albright who first suggested it is in the south of the Dead Sea, but because there's nothing there. You see, when the destruction of Sodom is described as though you can't find anything anymore. But that's not true. Jericho was destroyed. You can still excavate Jericho. Sodom was destroyed. You can still excavate Sodom. Certainly was not under the Dead Sea. But of course, people in their mind connect those two almost extraordinary events, that is the formation of the Dead Sea and the fiery destruction of Sodom, but they had nothing to do with each other. The Dead Sea was already there, because in Genesis 14 you read the battle between those four kings from Mesopotamia, and the battle with the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, and the battle took place in the Vale of Siddim, it says, which is the Dead Sea. That means that when the water level of the Dead Sea is high, because it fluctuates quite a bit, it is actually Dead Sea. When the water level is low, like it is today, then it is a valley. Now, since 2009, those sinkholes have appeared in the Dead Sea for the first time. So when the level of the Dead Sea goes down, and it goes down almost a meter every year, then the water, it gets sucked away from the side of the land, and the ground just collapses. Now you read, well, in the English Bible, that the kings fell into tar pits. But that's not what the Hebrew Bible said. They fell in borot gemar, in clay pits. And I think clay pits are the sinkholes. And therefore the Dead Sea existed already before Sodom was destroyed. So the two things have got nothing to do with each other. But sometimes you need to excavate and rationalize scientifically what happened in this site. And when did the Dead Sea, when was it formed? Well, long before Sodom was built, has been there since the creation of the world. And therefore you people connect to things which have nothing to do with each other, and that's interesting to find out, because you can put things right in your own mind.
Yeah. And when you're here in the land, you start to get it in a way that you can't possibly get it when you're not here. So let me ask you something. This might be a difficult question, and I know different archaeologists, Bible-believing archaeologists, at least on the Jewish side of things, and sometimes you come up with something that doesn't fit with the biblical narrative. And for some, it's a test of faith. For some, they keep it in two separate places. There's my science, there's my work, and there's my faith in God. But sometimes the biblical narrative doesn't jive with what we find in the area. So you, as a Christian, have you ever come up against that? Have you ever had the moments where this is not exactly what Scripture says, but it's okay and I don't care? Or is it plant doubts? How do you deal with that?
Well, if there are things that seem to contradict the Bible, then I put it in the back of my mind. I believe that if you read the Bible correctly, preferably in the Hebrew language, and you interpret archaeology correctly, without any preconceived ideas, then there is no conflict. For example, Jericho, it says that the wall fell down flat in the King James translation, but it says actually in the Hebrew that the wall fell tachteha, underneath herself. Well, how can a wall fall below itself? But now we understand that you got a stone revetment wall which still stands up today, which was topped by a brick wall, and that brick wall, the top part, that fell down below itself in that sense. So then it's when you don't understand something, also when you talk about different things, the way we live our lives, or what prophets say, if you go back to the original language and try and understand to whom that was written, then often you can solve the problems. So the Bible has been written for us, so we can have faith and we know how to conduct our lives, but it wasn't written to us. So we need to understand how the people who wrote the Bible, or to whom certain messages were given at that time, understood that. That may be very different from the way we understand it. So I would never use the Bible, the archaeology to prove the Bible, or the Bible to prove archaeology. I mean, the Bible for me is a book that gives me faith. When I worked with Professor Benjamin Mazar on the 10 Mount excavation, he always had the Tanakh on his desk. When he talked about it, he said, well, it's not a matter of faith with me, but it is my history book. And so I've had, for 4 years, I've had history lessons from the Bible with Professor Benjamin Mazar, and that gave me the tools how to deal with scriptural descriptions and marry them up with archaeological evidence. And then there is no conflict, and you can often learn things from archaeology to better understand what the Bible actually says. For example, before I got involved in the Shiloh excavations, I thought it was kind of a city, and they've got a big city wall, and you expect to find houses there, and there are no houses. We've got a city wall without houses. And then you read in Joshua that Joshua gathered all the tribes together in Shiloh. So of course, if it's a city full of houses and little streets, then you can't get all the tribes. But now we understand it was actually a Canaanite cult site. There was a Canaanite temple on top of the hill, and that was fortified by this massive city wall, which also doesn't make sense, because if people would have been living in Shiloh, the population would have been around 200-300 at most. They wouldn't have had the manpower and the economic resources to build a 5-meter thick city wall, which is as thick as the Temple Mount walls which King Herod the Great built. So it served as a Canaanite worship center that served a very large area, and all those Canaanite villages, they would have contributed to build this their major religious site. There must have been a temple, and that was of course destroyed in at the end of the Middle Bronze Age in about 1550. A site lay derelict all through the late Bronze Age, but then when the Israelites came with Joshua, they came to Shiloh because it's right in the center of the tribe of Ephraim, is in the center of the land, and therefore it was quite a practical solution to make that the center for Israelite worship. So they put the tabernacle where the Canaanite temple used to stand. It's still all open, like the Dome of the Rock. It's set in the middle of a big open platform, because it's designed for people to come together for religious purposes. That happened in the Canaanite period, and Joshua just adapted it. Nothing to do, doesn't mean say that the Israelites start to worship Canaanite gods. No, the site was derelict for a long time, but it's a very suitable place for national worship. So I think that he put the Mishkan, the tabernacle, in the place where the Canaanite temple that was destroyed used to stand. And it was a beautiful place, fortified, strongly fortified, not for defense purposes, but to give it status. It was kind of the religious capital in a Canaanite period, and it was the religious capital in the time of Joshua. So they used it was a very practical move to turn that derelict site into a new site, the center for Israelite worship. I think it's quite sensible. But I never had it in my mind before I started to be involved in the Shiloh excavations. So that helped me fill out the picture. I think the best way to use biblical archaeology is to use it to illuminate the Bible. Not to prove the Bible, but you must get rid of preconceived ideas. When I was asked to join the Tel al-Hammam excavations in Jordan, which we now believe is Sodom, when Steve Collins rang me up and said, because I've been working with him in Gibeton Makata near Bet El here many years, I said, you don't be silly, you can't find Sodom, because it says in the New Testament that Sodom is an example of an eternal fire. It was so badly destroyed you can never find it anymore. Well, I said, come have a look. So I did. I changed my mind. So Sodom was destroyed, of course, with fire from the heavens, as the Bible says, but still an archaeological site which you can excavate, and I'm glad I joined, because it gave me an insight which I could never have had without excavating them.
Wow. So let's get to the Temple Mount. So you're working with Benjamin Mazar and around the Temple Mount, and then you become interested in the mountain itself. Just to tell my listeners, some of whom may not be familiar with your book, we'll give information out later. You have the pictures in there already from when it's Goren, from when it's new. I'm forgetting my English. A threshing floor. Thank you. Okay. Which is incidentally, talk about topography speaking for itself. Perfect. Because it's a hill, but it's not a very high hill. Sometimes I stand and I look around and I think, well, you wouldn't have put a threshing floor, let's say, on the top of the Mount of Olives, because everything would blow away, and you wouldn't put it down in the valley because nothing would move. So it's just like a Goldilocks. It's just right for a threshing floor. But the sketches that you have are not just of the building, the temple buildings or whatever you have been able to find, but all the way back. So obviously we have not dug down there and found the threshing floor. How were you able to sense where the mountain itself is and where everything, the transition of all the different stages of the Temple Mount?
Yeah, well, of course, the first thing I did was to understand the Herodian Temple Mount, and not only the southern wall where we excavated with Professor Benjamin and the southern part of the western wall where the where the Robinson's Arch is, but the whole length. I want to know the whole outline of the Herodian Temple Mount. So the southern wall, the eastern wall, the northern wall, and the west wall, as much as has been preserved of those walls. But then I was also interested in how where did the temple stand? And what did the Temple Mount look like before King Herod the Great extended the Temple Mount? Because you got to read historical sources like the two works of Josephus, Joseph ben Mattatyahu, the War of the Jews and the history, the antiquities of the Jews, and then you get an idea that Herod used an existing Temple Mount and extended to the north and to the west and to the south, not to the east because the slope of the Kidron Valley was too steep. And then I remember that my predecessor pointed out one of a particular step. So there are two levels on the Temple Mount, the level at which you enter, and the Dome of the Rock stands on a higher platform. Now also in Herod's time, if you read in the Mishnah, for example, you go up by 14 steps from the lower to the upper level. And so when this area became an Islamic platform for the Dome of the Rock, there you get staircases going up. All the staircases are parallel with the wall they're built into, but not one on the northwest. They had a different orientation. Now, if you build a staircase, you don't start on the top, you start on the bottom. So you look at the bottom step to get clues why it's in different directions. And then I found out that was actually the top of a wall. And you could still see part of the margin and part of the boss, which the typical masonry used to have. As soon as the Muslims learned about it, they put new pavement over, so you can't see the side anymore. Then when I measured from that step, as I call it, to the eastern wall, that was 252 meters, which translated into cubits. That say there are two kind of cubits. You get the short cubits from elbow to fingertip, which is 45 centimeters. There's also a larger, the sacred or the royal cubit, which is the same cubit plus the handbreadth, the 4 fingers. That's exactly 500 cubits. I remember that it says in the Mishnah that the Temple Mount measured 500 by 500 cubits. Then I went to the Golden Gate and I found masonry that can be archaeologically dated to the 8th century BC. So I got the western wall of that early platform, I got the eastern wall of the platform, and I measured along the eastern wall to the south, and there was a slight change in direction at 500 cubits. And using that dating mechanism of the way stones are tooled, and you can tell from the stone which tools they used, and we've got other examples, they date to the 8th century. And I think that King Hezekiah, he was the greatest builder, apart from King Herod the Great in Jerusalem, that he built that 500 cubic square platform. And that was for the first time called Harabait. You come across the name Harabait for the first time in the prophet Isaiah and Micah, and also in Chronicles when Manasseh speaks about Harabait that was built then by his father. So even from a historical point of view, the use of the term Harabait, which is an architectural term for an artificial platform, Harabait, so there was an artificial amount for the bait, for the house, the temple, that originated in the time of the end of the first temple period by, I think it was King Hezekiah who built that.
And do the Hasmoneans, when they come and refurbish, they don't change that at all?
No, they add it to the south. You can see that in the eastern wall there's a Hasmonean extension, because when during the Maccabean rebellion they destroyed the Accra fortress, and then they added to the Temple Mount, or the Accra fortress to the south between the double and triple gates, now in between the double and triple gate tunnels. And then they destroyed the Accra and added that area to the south of the Temple Mount, and then Herod built around it. But then you get a difficulty if you see the Herodian Temple Mount, for example, with 4 gates in the western wall. You read Josephus and he says there are 4 gates in the western wall. You read the Mishnah, there's 1 gate in the western wall. That was written after the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. He said, well, I scratch your head, what do you know the difference between 1 and 4? But then I realized, again, talking with other scholars, especially Benjamin Mazar, that the Jewish authorities at the time did not recognize Herod's editions as part of the Temple Mount. For them, that earlier Temple Mount, which now was a kind of a courtyard inside the extended Temple Mount, that was Harabait for them. And there must be only one gate in that western wall, which actually lies about 25 meters inside the present-day western wall. So the present-day western wall is not Solomonic, it's Herodian, and about 25 meters to the west of the original western wall. And then you wonder why they did not recognize Herod's addition as holy, as part of the Har Habayit, of the Temple Mount. And I think it is because the extension was built outside Mount Moriah. See, now where did the temple stand? It stood on the summit of the mountain, says Josephus, and I believe that inside the dome of the rock you can see the top of the mountain. It's not a separate rock, it's the Evanastia, which means the foundation stone, and found inside or carved in the rock the foundation trench for the southern wall of Solomon's Holy of Holies, and the western scarp is where the west wall stood, and then the northern scarp, exactly 20 cubits away. It all fits, but then I want people to understand, because some people think they go inside the Dome of the Rock, or you used to be able to go inside the Dome of the Rock, that is a separate stone. They cannot visualize that it's the top of the mountain. Now Warren, who worked here in Jerusalem in the 1860s, 70s, he had access to all the underground cisterns, and he recorded wherever bedrock.
He took access, let's say.
He went inside. Let's not go into that. He's a very clever man. But he recorded bedrock levels wherever he could, and he made a topographical map, which I used then to reconstruct Mount Moriah, as it were. Now, take into consideration how the mountains in Judea are built. They are got horizontal layers, terrace-wise. So I used that. You can see all the mountains around Jerusalem are built very similarly. And so I made a drawing, and then to start off with Mount Moriah, because when Abram was sent to Mount Moriah, there was nothing there. So that's drawing number one. And then you've got David, of course, when with Araunah, the Jebusite king, and the angel appeared to him. Then you read that the angel stood between heaven and earth. And David was in the threshing floor. Well, did the angel float somewhere in the sky? No, I think he stood on the top of that mountain between heaven and earth, because he is a mediator between David and God himself. He would have stood on the highest point of the mountain, which is inside the Dome of the Rock. Therefore, that became the holy place. Threshing floors are never built on top of the mountain, as you said earlier, but slightly below the top, about 3 meters below the top. So if you throw a window, all your produce in the air, then the wind will take the lighter particles, the chaff, dump it a bit further down, and the grain falls straight down. And therefore that is where David built an altar. And I think that's the same place where Abram had built an altar to sacrifice his son Isaac, the Akedat Yitzchak, and where the isle was the ram with his corn, with horns caught in the thicket. So that is then, I start off with the time of Abram. There was just nothing there, but I put his altar where later we learned the threshing floor was, because Araunah used it as an agricultural area. He was growing wheat on the terraces, and you need a threshing floor. I'm sure there's a wine press somewhere there and an olive press, but we haven't found that yet. And then, of course, you got the altar of David, and then Solomon's temple must have been built on the place where the angel stood, the Holy of Holies, the top of the mountain, and that's where I found the actual archaeological evidence carved in the rock of the Holy of Holies. And if you draw a line through the axis of the temple, it points exactly to the top of the Mount of Olives. So that gives us then an east-west axis along which the temple was built, with the Holy of Holies and the Holy and the porch, whatever else you have. So then I got a kind of a framework to work with, starting with Mount Moriah, understanding where the threshing floor was, understanding where the temple stood, and then you can add-on to the courts that were built, and Joshua built an extra court, which later became the court of the women. And you fill out a picture of the whole history of the Temple Mount, the architectural development of the Temple Mount up to today, because I've got a reconstruction of the Muslim Temple Mount as well, with the Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock there as well. So I wanted to fill out the whole history of Mount Moriah, actually. And I published a large book called The Quest, Revealing the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in 2006. It's still being sold today. And many universities use that as their textbook to teach about the temple layout and to help people understand the Temple Mount. The interested tourist that comes here. Kathleen, my wife, and myself have devised 6 tours, written and illustrated in that book, on top and around and underneath the Temple Mount. So you can actually walk around with that book. Only be careful not to use it on top of the Temple Mount, because they don't like it that you use our book. And then you can kind of understand the Temple Mount. And that's what I want. I want people to understand the Temple Mount. I was giving a tour about 3 days ago to some very high Israeli officials, and it said it makes me mad when I read that the Jews are still praying at the only remnant of Solomon's temple. I said, no, it's not Solomon's temple. It's an Herodian wall, which wasn't even considered holy at the time. I don't want to take anything away from the Jewish desire to pray at the Western Wall, but it's not Solomon's wall. So I want to educate the people really about the history of the Temple Mount.
Do you see destruction from time to time that you go up there, because you're so intimately familiar with the top of the Temple Mount for the last 50 years, and you go up now? Do you see what's happening up there?
Well, all through, since the 70s, since I started, I've been trying to cover up things very much. In the northern part of the Temple Mount, just below the Antonia Forge, was quite a large section of Herodian pavement. Now they dumped 1.5 meters of soil on top of it, the whole northern courtyard. They grow olive trees, but they try to deny that there ever was a Jewish presence on the Temple Mount. You go to the Golden Gate. By the way, I spent a whole week in the 70s inside the Golden Gate to draw it up, all the walls, all the elevation, making sections and platform. But next to it, under a bit of a tarpaulin, you find there wooden beams, cedar beams and some pine beams that were reused. They were taken out of the Al-Aqsa Mosque when it was destroyed by the earthquake in 1927, just half rotting away. And they did then the chronology on those trees, and 1 or 2 date back to about 3,000 years ago. They may have been used in Solomon's temple. Now it's a price. It
could be the cedars of Lebanon, and what's going on?
Yes, certainly. But there were no cedars in this country. And, your hands are itchy, so well, let's put them in a museum or something like that. But they don't allow it. And, of course, then they dug that big hole in the Temple Mount in the southeastern corner, understandably, to get access to the Solomon stables, which are now the Marwani Mosque, and for security reasons. I understand all that, but then let's dig it in an archaeological, scientific way. But they send in bulldozers, and now they're still sifting in Ein Sorim all the stuff that came out of there. Well, that's not necessary. You can work together. So you understand, they had permission from the Israeli government to dig an entrance to the Solomon stable, but then do it professionally. They're sending bulldozers in the middle of the night and carting out 100 truckloads of dirt. That is not the way we should treat each other.
Well, you're not naive, so you understand that they're not doing professionally just because they don't have the time. They are intentionally undermining the Jewish and Christian history and anybody who isn't Muslim up on the Mount, and they're destroying precious artifacts.
By they're destroying their own Temple Mount walls. Do you remember that a few years ago there were bulges sticking out on the southern wall and in the eastern wall? I've got a blog on Ritmeyer.com, and I was writing about it. How did it suddenly happen? Of course, they blame the Jews for it, the Israelis for it, but that's just their own fault, because when they paved that huge area to the east of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they use limestone flags, that's okay, but they cement it together with Portland cement. Well, I've got an MA in conservation studies. You never use Portland cement with limestone, number one. But by sealing off that whole pavement hermetically, the rain that falls on it, which used to be soaked into the ground underneath, has nowhere to go. It runs to the side, and it goes into the walls. Now the walls, the upper part of the Temple Mount walls, were built with one stone course on the outside and one stone course on the inside, but the middle core was often filled with rubble and soil. So that started to soak up that excess water, which didn't normally drain into the ground, and the wall starts to swell, and that's why those bulges appeared. It's nobody else's fault but people that hermetically sealed off the pavement in the southeastern corner of the Temple Mount.
And I think it's the Jordanians that did the patch job there, did a terrible job. It's very unsightly.
Yeah, well, it's very unsightly, and all that is not necessary. If you just, they're just afraid that Israelis will take over the Temple Mount. But why can't you just normally work together? Here's a technical problem. Let's solve it in a technical way, in a scientific way. If you want to excavate an entrance to the Marwani Mosque, okay, but then let's dig it and you can't dig anywhere in the old city without archaeological supervision. Why should the Temple Mount be any different?
Because, I'll put in my opinion here, my government dropped the ball on this, but we'll leave that aside because I don't want to get too much into politics, but it's something that I think has only lowered our standing here in the Middle East because we have allowed ourselves to be disrespected on the holiest site possibly on the planet, but definitely to Judaism. That was a very big mistake, but I don't want to get dragged off too much into politics, but it's definitely something that's a constant hurt. Are you at all involved with the Temple Mount sifting, where they've taken some of this rubble and looked through it?
No, I visited, but I'm not involved in it because I don't live in the country anymore. And they're doing a fabulous job. They're finding all sorts of material, but it's not dug in a stratigraphic way. So we don't even know where the fill came from. See, the whole eastern part of the Temple Mount, between the southeastern corner and the Golden Gate, was much lower than it was today. The eastern wall was very badly destroyed, and all the rubble of the Temple Mount destruction in 70 AD, the Roman destruction, was pushed over the eastern wall, so that the original course of the Kidron Valley was pushed 14 meters to the east. And that whole area, you can see on ancient paintings from the Middle Ages, they were growing trees there. So that whole area has been filled since the Middle Ages. Now, where did they get the rubble from, which they're excavating now? I don't know where it came from. Now, they like to say it came from the Temple Mount. If it came from the Temple Mount, where did they get so much rubble from the Temple Mount from? So I don't know where it came from, and nobody knows. Right. So it's of great importance, but of limited archaeological importance. I don't want to say anything against them. They do a fabulous job and they're finding very interesting find, but you may find a shekel from the Second Temple period next to a Turkish pipe. So that kind of diminishes the value of the work they are doing. That could all have been prevented if it was excavated in a proper archaeological way. And that's a great pity. I'm not politically involved. I not want to blame anybody, but as I look upon the Temple Mount, for myself personally, it's a site of great importance. But I treat it as an archaeological site. It should be treated with dignity, both by Israelis and Palestinians. It's a pity if that doesn't happen.
Yeah. You know, it occurred to me on the way over here that Ehud Netzer, who was also one of the great archaeologists, he dug tremendously at Jericho and at Masada and at Herodian, where he tragically died after what we think he found Herod's grave, and then he fell to his death there, taking with him a tremendous amount of knowledge. And even though his students have picked it up, it's still not the same. But he had studied architecture before he became an archaeologist, and I was thinking about that on the way over here to speak with you. And you mentioned it to me that that's because you didn't get to work with him because he could do his own drawings. But do you think that also gave him, from your perspective, a tremendous advantage as an archaeologist, especially dealing with Herod, because he could kind of get into his head because he knew how he built?
Yeah, because the sites Ehud Netzer worked with, there were palaces, there were 80% architecture, and he was the right man to excavate those sites. If you dig a site like Megiddo or Tel Azika or Lachish, there's just a normal tell with normal rubble-made walls, and you don't need to be an architect so much as you deal with sites which are full of architects, like the Temple Mount, for example. So Ehud Netzer, he was a trained architect and he studied archaeology, and he was eminently placed to deal with those palaces, because you see the sites he dug are all architectural sites. I would call them architectural sites.
Right.
You know, Herodian's palace, and actually I made a reconstruction drawing of Hyrcania, another Herodian palace. But it's all architecture. You can't dig stratigraphically like you do a tell. So those sites are not tells. Apart from even Jericho, they were the palaces, weren't they? It's not tell Jericho, which you dig in a very different way, and it is an advantage when you dig in a site that is dominated by architecture. When I worked in the Jewish quarter, it got interesting for me. I worked with Benjamin Mazar, with Nachman Avigat and Yigor Yadin, and all such different people with different interests, and they give a different input into the way you study a site. So Benjamin Mazar, I say, he always asked why. He was an historian. He wanted to know why certain things happened. His perhaps the understanding of architecture was a bit limited because that's not his field. We worked together very well, but Avigat he's a trained architect also, and then he studied archaeology very much like Ehud Netzer, and that helped me very much in my architectural understanding and my architectural work, because you understand my architecture better, but Mazar understood the history better.
And Yadin was a military man, so he probably brought some of that in, maybe?
No, I worked with Yadin on the Temple Mount scroll. So one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the longest one, was the Temple Scroll, in which a temple has been described, which had 3 concentric square courtyards. The inner one, which had the temple, and then you have the middle one, which measured 500 cubic square. It was 480 they write down, but that is measured from the inside. You had the thickness of the walls, and the 10 on each side. You come to 500 cubic square, exactly like the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And then you have a huge outer court of 1,600 cubits. A bit like Ezekiel's temple, because there's a temple described that they've got 3,000 cubits on the outside. And so the Mazar told Yadin that he should come to me, and I made reconstruction drawings of the temple from a temple scroll. So for the first time I made drawings from a scroll and not from archaeology. That's quite an interesting experience.
Wow. You illustrated the book, as it were.
Yeah, so I made big reconstruction drawings. And actually 2 years ago, as a Jewish professor in Jerusalem, in New York, Lawrence Schiefman, and he brings out now a new edition of the Temple Scroll, and I made another 10 drawings for him as well. So
I got to interview him last year in England. We were together. He's a fascinating man, and what he has found.
Yeah, so I've been working with him and making videos. So he gave me his draft text, and he wanted me to illustrate it. So more illustrations of the house of utensils, and a closer reconstruction of the altar, and things which I didn't do for Yadin. For Yadin was mainly 4 major drawings: the overall temple complex, close-up drawings of the inner complex, and then of the gateways, because there are massive gateways described in the Temple Scroll. And of course, I had fascinating discussions with Yadin. Because I asked him, what kind of a temple are we talking about? It's not a Jerusalem temple, and whether they want to build it. Must it be built in Jerusalem or somewhere else? Now he understood from their writings that they wanted to build this temple somewhere in Israel, not particularly in Jerusalem, in the belief that once the temple is square, it's going to be destroyed, and then Messiah will come and build the new temple. And Josephus wrote that when the Romans destroyed the Antonia fortress and then made themselves away into the Temple Mount became a square. Of course it did, because the next line of defense was the 500 cubic square Temple Mount. And as it is recorded in their oracle, says Josephus, it is going to be destroyed. And Yadin explains that the oracles was actually the Temple Scroll, because they wanted to go to this enormous expense to build this huge square Temple Mount, only in the belief it's going to be shortly destroyed after it's completed, and then Messiah will come and build a true temple on the Temple Mount. It's fascinating. Those things you could never know.
No, it's mixing in the context of the theology at the time with the building.
That's right. So that is the information you get, and you get enriched by working with those people. I never thought I'd go to working with a Dead Sea Scroll, but I did. And Yadin used to come to my house, and we had a lovely discussion. My wife made a cup of tea for him, and you get to know all those great archaeologists, and it's just wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, the names that you're saying now, these are the greats. I mean, these are really the greats of Israeli archaeology.
Yeah, they were. But now you got the next generations. I worked a lot with Ami Mazar, for example. I worked for 11 years in Tel Battash, which is Timnah of the Philistines, and I still do a lot of work with archaeologists. I work with Dan Oorman in the Golan Heights, a huge amount of Byzantine buildings, and life is never boring.
Do your children understand the role that you've played here in people's understanding of this tremendous site?
Yes, well, one son is especially interested in Israel. He comes here frequently. He was here a month ago. He spent with his family 2 weeks here traveling and also to different sites. But now our children are grown up. They go themselves to Jerusalem and said, "Oh, I remember being here. What happens here?" And they see the old school buildings. And well, they said, Mom and Dad to us said, "Why can't you write our story up?" Yeah. So we did. You did? Last year. On the occasion of our 40th anniversary, we wrote a book, Our Israel Years, telling the story how I grew up in Holland, and that what brought me to Israel, how Kathleen grew up in Ireland, and what brought her to Jerusalem, and how we met, and all the places we visited, and the trips we went on, and when the children came along, where they went to school, and all the excavations I dragged them to. I got a picture of my second son. He was about 3 years old. With an overall with tools painted on, standing in the car, which I was restoring at the moment, and they love it because it fills in a gap in the history. All our Israel years have been described until we left 89, but we came back in 93. Well, I came back every year, but with the family in 93 and 94 when I was asked to help with the Tel Nitzana excavation in the Negev. And so it's all written down, but that's not published. It's we printed them hardcover, but only for our family.
So the architecture that you do now, you just build regular buildings for regular people?
No. So I only work in biblical archaeology.
Oh, okay.
I'm working on a very interesting project together with Kathleen at the moment. 2 years ago, the United Bible Societies, now that is the overarching body. So lots of countries have got their own Bible Society. You've got the American Bible Society, you've got the Dutch Bible Society, the South African. There are 160 of them all together, working and distributing Bibles and translating them in about 300 different languages in more than 200 countries. And there's all printed Bibles. The Bible's been translated into, I don't know how many African languages there are. And they want to bring out a digital Bible, an online Bible. A Bible based on augmented reality. So they asked me to do that for them, to start off with making maps of every journey in the Bible.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, starting with Abram coming down from Ophel into the land, up to, in the New Testament, all wherever the disciples traveled and Paul's journeys, and make maps then using Google Maps, so I can accurately trace the route. For example, you read in Genesis 37 verse 1 that Jacob, who was in the Vale of Hebron, sent his son Joseph, said, "Go to Shechem and see how your brothers are and how the flocks are." You read it in one sentence. You can put in your sat-nav like we do. We go from A to B. But to me, if I try to think if I was Joseph, I was 17 years old, your brothers hated you, they wanted to kill you. Now your father sent you away to find your brothers. Well, how would he have been prepared himself to meet his brothers and have the courage to actually to face up to them? If you start traveling, the first thing is the Tomb of Machpelah, where Abram and Sarah are buried, and Isaac and Rebecca. And then you travel further north, you come to Bethlehem, where Kever Rachel is. His mother was buried there. And I think he would have experienced his loneliness even more. There's no protection by his father, his mother is dead. And then he passed by Mount Moriah. We're thinking about Isaac. Well, Isaac was 17 years old and he was about to be sacrificed. And what about me? So Isaac was ready to lay down his life because God asked for him. And must I lay down my life? And perhaps I think his whole mindset changed. And he went to Bethel, where his father had a dream. He went to the place. He went to Bethel. And he took one of the stones of the place, which I think was one of the top stone of the altar which Abraham had built, and he slept on that stone as if Jacob himself presented himself as a sacrifice. And he had a dream of that ladder going up to heaven, and now the angel of God going up and down. And I think all that prepared himself to go and face his brothers, and to lay down his life if necessary, because that's what Isaac did, that's what Jacob did, and perhaps he had to do the same. And he came to Shechem and he wasn't there. I would have run back straight to my dad, you see. And he met a certain man, and he said, what are you seeking for? He said, I seek my brothers. Now that's a wonderful statement, that youngest son of Jacob was looking after his older brothers who went astray and went to Dothan, and they almost killed him there, and he was sent away to Egypt. But that journey was described in one sentence, shows you the whole development of the mind of Joseph to prepare to lay down his life for his brothers. Now that is an amazing thing, which you can only get from geography. So I plan that route, and I describe all the stations he would have met and how that would have prepared him for the great meeting away from his father to his brothers, not knowing what's going to happen to him, but he persisted in doing his father's will. Now that's an amazing thing, for example. And then I finished all those maps, about 300 maps in the Bible, and they're going to be, I'd make them on Google Earth, Google Maps, so you can actually trace them out exactly using the ancient routes. And they're going to be changed into 3D reality, where they're going to use Google Earth, for example, I don't know. But then you can fly over the train, over the route of the patriarchs, the way of the patriarchs from Hebron to Shechem, to Shem and beyond. But then people can actually follow that journey. Whether it could be a moving object, that's just not my business. And now I'm just going back to starting in Genesis. They asked us initially to develop more than 200 mappable and events that can be illustrated. So now I'm just getting all the illustrations ready. I bought all my reconstruction drawings, and I've got many more photographs. I can use Todd Boland's photographs from Bible places to illustrate the Bible. For example, Lot set in the gate, so I showed them the archaeological evidence for the gate which we excavated, my reconstruction drawing, and I describe all the images and I write a storyline. So in brief, that people in brief can actually, if they don't want to read through the whole chapter, then you got a storyline what this event was all about. So you get Genesis to creation, you got Noah's flood, and you got Abram's journeys, and all those things that go right through the Bible, and that is a fascinating project. So I'm sitting at my desk. I'm still back in the country here.
I'm thinking to myself, in addition to all the adjectives that you used to describe yourself at the beginning, that you could add biblical commentator here as well, because it sounds to me that that's what you're doing. You're using your knowledge of the architecture, of the geography, but also of perhaps the mindset of the person who's on, let's say, this particular journey, and you're able to illuminate maybe a thought process that is not necessarily something that's been done up until now because of the tools that you have at your disposal that others haven't had.
No, that's right. So that's now a privilege to share the experience I've had in learning getting to know most of the biblical sites, because I've worked in so many of them, and by making reconstruction drawings, I can visualize for other people what a site looked like. And now, because I read the Bible every day, so in our community we read the Tanakh once in the year and the New Testament twice. So must have read the Bible about 50 times now. Mm-hmm. And now doing this work, I'm all the time consulting the Bible, archaeology, got the whole library at home. So I use all the information, so the biblical text, archaeological information, geographical information, whatever else I have to paint the picture of the Bible. So it becomes a bit of an interesting book, not just a textbook which people read and squabble about.
Do you ever look at the biblical commentators, let's say, because you also can read the Hebrew, or although they've been translated into every language, let's say Rashi or others, the big commentators on the Bible?
Yes, of course. I use the Jewish commentaries, and I use Christian commentaries, and I don't try to push my own ideas, but I try to read around the topic, get as much information from the people, and then crystallize it, and then present it. But because the people know me for my long time here in Israel and my insight in archaeology and the geography and all that, they just came to me. So yeah, normally people retire, but they don't give me a chance to retire.
No, I don't think you're retiring at all, let alone anytime soon. I just planned a trip to the Totan Valley in the summer, a bus trip. It's going to be out there pretty soon. If anybody's going to be in Israel, I'd love to see you there. And a few years ago, when I was there and I was speaking to one of the Jewish shepherds there, and he was telling me of a conversation he had with an Arab shepherd not long before, this is in the heat of the summer, who said that he was actually from Eshtamoa. He was from the southern Hebron Hills. But at the end of the summer, there's nothing for the flocks to eat in the southern Hebron Hills, and he comes up, and it's a good 100 kilometers at least, to the Dotan Valley, which is exactly what Joseph's brothers are doing up there, because why would you go so far from home with your flocks? You're looking for something for them to eat. And of course, we know that it was the heat of the summer because Joseph is thrown into a cistern that's empty of water, which is the situation you're going to find. So when you're there, you put it all together, and you still see people today doing similar journeys, maybe for different reasons, but some of the reasons still hold.
Yeah. For example, when you read that Abram and Lot had to separate because there was not enough pasture for their flocks, well, the country is big enough, isn't it?
Yeah.
But of course, there was a time when the city-states were being developed. And they controlled huge amounts of ground, and they couldn't graze on their ground, so the little strips in between was very little to graze on, and therefore they need to travel very far as you're going to the Negev and all that. So all that traveling was caused by the development of the city-states in the Middle Bronze Age. So then you can give the background of why did they have to travel, why did they have to separate. Is land not big enough? But land's big enough. It was controlled by all those Canaanite city-states, and that's why.
Which is something that I think a lot of the traditional biblical commentators didn't know. They didn't necessarily have access to some of the other sources, let's say like mid-Bronze Age that we have today.
Yeah, well, that's right. So if you read, say, commentaries of the 17th century, 18th century, they don't have the knowledge of the country. The Yediat Haaretz is kind of missing. And now we've learned so much by living in the land and talking to archaeologists, historians and all that, and reading commentaries, so that your mind's kind of bursting, and then you've got to find a way to shape it in a manageable form for people to whet their appetite, to get a picture of the background of the Bible, and then to hopefully they will study themselves a bit further, because I can't put everything I know into one project. But if you stimulate people, what I hope to achieve is to read the Bible a bit more carefully. For example, in America there's quite a movement among evangelicals to say that the temple stood in the city of David. That's based on a misreading of an Old Testament verse and a New Testament verse. But the Bible says this, you see. So you get, for example, in Matthew 24, Jesus sitting on the Mount of Olives and his disciples pointing out the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said, not one stone shall be left upon another. They go to the western wall, 7 stone courts still standing up, 19 down below. So either Jesus is a liar or the temple was somewhere else. So he said that must be, Jesus can't lie, of course. Therefore the temple was somewhere else. Then you read in Psalm 87, talking about Zion, about the singers and praiseful instruments. All my springs are in there. So the temple must be built over a spring. But if you read carefully, the disciples were not pointing out the one temple mount. You can't even see it because there was the eastern wall in front of the eastern wall. The buildings in the plural of the temple. Now, how do you understand that? Well, no, in the Temple Mount, there were many buildings on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is just a platform on which all those buildings, the temple, the gates that were built around it, the court of the women, the porticos, and everything. Those are the buildings of the temple. Now, I've studied the Temple Mount well enough to know that indeed not one stone is left upon another. So Jesus wasn't a liar. They misread what Jesus said. They were not talking about the Temple Mount walls. All my springs are in thee. In Zion, within the wall, there's only one spring. So how can you say that the temple stood over the Gihon spring? Doesn't even fit there. Right. So there are 2 reasons why it can't stand there. Just recently, a few years ago, the Tel Aviv University has been digging the slope, on the eastern slope, from the city of David down to the Kidron Valley. They found rubbish 70 meters high. Yigo Shilo, he found a 2.5 meter thick layer covering the stone step structure. But you can't build on rubble. I know the temple well enough. So if the temple stood there, you would find a big hole in the rubble. It isn't there. And then, but then how do you cope? Where are the springs then? So then I go to the Hebrew, where it speaks about the Meshorim and the place, the Meganim. And then it says, Kol Mayanei Bach. All my springs are in thee. But in the ancient Hebrew was written as one string of letters. There were no word dividers. That came later when you put dots in between. So I think you should read it Kulam, Kulam, all the singers and all the players of instruments. Einai Bach. My eyes upon this. What God said to Solomon when he prays, that my eyes are always on this place. So I didn't talk about springs, because I know springs in Jerusalem, there's only one. The temple never stood upon it. So based on those two passages, they got an enormous following. Because the Bible says that not one stone shall be left upon another. It must be the Antonia fortress. But Josephus, right, to capture the Temple Mount, the Romans raised the Antonia fortress down to its foundations. You can see that there's only a rock standing there. Right. So they read one little passage to build a whole theory upon it, and they got a huge following because Jesus said this, and therefore he must be right. It's a total wrong interpretation. They don't read the Bible carefully, and they make assumptions which can be supported by archaeological evidence.
Oh. And they don't read it in Hebrew, because the explanation you just gave about how the Hebrew words were divided make it into a completely different meaning. It doesn't mean a spring. It means the end of one word and then eyes. Yes. So incredible.
And that fits, doesn't it? Because that God says, my eyes and my heart are always be in this place. And that fits beautifully.
Amazing. So if we piqued their curiosity and now they want to read some of what you've put out, how do they get a hold of your work?
We publish about 10 books about Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount. You can buy them from Carta. You can buy them in the better bookshops in the Israel Museum. You can buy them from Amazon. Okay.
And you said you have a blog as well?
Yes, I run a blog, ritmeyer.com. When the Golden Gate was recently in the news, then I wrote a whole article about the Golden Gate. They actually photographed me standing right in the middle of the Golden Gate. I told them all about the work I did. I showed them the drawings I made, and to give people the right information. So I think if you have the right information, they can draw the right conclusions. If you start with wrong conclusions, you never believe any hard evidence. It's kind of a circular reasoning, and you don't get anywhere. So
you've got your work cut out for you.
Yeah, that's right. So my message is, read the Bible. If you read the Bible, read it accurately, and get some information. When you read about a journey, most Bibles got a set of maps at the back. Then look at the maps, or look at photographs, and then try and put yourself in the person who is traveling, and get as much information, because you get insights which you would never otherwise get. Right. That's what I hope to do.
Yeah, and that's the joy that I get of knowing the land, of touring the land, and of having a master's degree in psychology, so that I can even try and get the thought process in there as well, and of having raised children, so you get an idea of what they're thinking or trying, and it all comes together. Look, we all bring who we are to what it is that we're doing, and I think we all have a role to play in God's world, and you have played an outsized role, really, in Israel and in architecture and archaeology and everything that you've done. So I want to thank you, because I know that you have tremendously enhanced what I do to be able to rely. I cheat because you did all the hard work. I just open your book. But it's really marvelous, and I know that I'm not alone, that I'm able to educate many other people based on the tremendously hard work and effort that you've made over the years. And so I want to thank you for all of that, and for the generations to come who will use your insights and your understanding to illuminate their own.
Okay. Well, that's very nicely put. And thank you very much for interviewing me again.
Okay. Thank you again, and I hope to see you back.
Okay. All the best then. Bye-bye, Eve. Okay.
All right, everyone. Leen Ritmeyer. This is Eve Harrow on Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network. I really enjoyed this talk. I hope you guys did as well. Be in touch with me if you want more information, how to spell everything, and how to get into exactly what he's doing. So I will be back next week. Take care, everybody. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Tabitha. Goodbye for now.
This week on Inside Israel Today on the Land of Israel Network, on thelandofisrael.com, Gil Hoffman will speak about whether Netanyahu has entered a political minefield in the repeat election. And he will interview Einad Wilf, former member of Knesset from the Labour Party, about whether the Labour Party is doomed to die and whether there